Hey guys, welcome back to Albrecht Gaming. Today I'd like to discuss the Kazuha banner and whether or not it's worth rolling on. Let's get into it. The featured 5-star on the banner is Katahara Kazuha, an Anemo sword user from Inazuma. The 4-star rate-ups this time around are Razor, Rosaria, and Bennett. The likeliest roles for these characters are Kazuha as Anemo support, Razor as Electro main DPS, Rosaria as Cryo support, and Bennett as Pyro support. Whether you're free to play, a whale, or anything in between, I think this is one of the better banners that Genshin Impact has had. Now, it's important to get this out of the way early. Do not spend money on anything that you can't afford to. Genshin Impact is a game, and it's not worth putting yourself in financial jeopardy to roll. It could cost a substantial amount of money to get Kazuha, or anyone else on this banner for that matter. It's such a good banner though, guys. I used Razor as a main DPS for most of my leveling from AR 20-ish to around 50-ish, and he was great. And I consider Rosaria to be a better version of Chongyun, and Bennett is, well, Bennett. If you don't have a solid main DPS, it's hard for me not to suggest Razor as a good choice to pick up here. I think the main problem to consider is that we're going into Inazuma soon, which presumably will have a considerable amount of Electro enemies. We could trigger Superconduct with a Cryo Applicator, but then Razor's Electro damage could be wasted on Electro mobs. The nice thing is that Razor does a huge amount of his damage as physical, so he could still perform here, unlike a character that just had Electro attacks. I think the sweet spot for Razor, if you want to pick him up, would be to aim for his C4. Going into Inazuma, Rosaria is going to be a strong choice. With the likely prevalence of Electro mobs, she should be all you need to trigger Superconduct, and she is capable of performing as a main DPS if you want to build her into that role, specifically as a physical damage DPS. I think a sweet spot for Rosaria would be to aim for her C2 or higher, with her C4 and C6 being particularly useful. Bennett is a great choice for a healer in most situations, but his constellations are something you need to keep an eye on. A C6 Bennett changes sword, claymore, and polearm damage to pyro. If you already have a C5 Bennett, don't worry about rolling for him, and certainly don't activate his C6 if you get it. With that said, his best quality is that he's Pyro, and we have some top-tier Pyro DPS units. If you have a Diluc, or a Hu Tao, or a Zhongling team, Bennett is a great addition because his element provides you with the 25% Fervent Flames resonance. Something to keep in mind here, though, is that we're going to be going to an Electro zone soon. Pyro and Electro creates overload, which means you might spend a lot of time running after the enemies you hit. But if you want to get Bennett, I think a sweet spot to aim for is his C1, although his C3 and C5 are also advantageous. But those are the 4 stars, so what about Kazuha? It's important to note that I'm making this video before playing Kazuha, and I'm doing that on purpose. A fair attempt at evaluating him will take me a couple of days, and I don't want to spread misinformation about how good I think he is or isn't before I've had a chance to really get to try him out. That said, I speculate that he will be a relatively good Anemo support, and that his C1 and C2 are both reasonable if you luck into them. But remember that 5-star constellations are hard to get for anyone who isn't a whale, so you really shouldn't go for them unless you have both the extra money and the interest in doing so. I do think he could make a really cool support for Zhongling in particular, with both of their Qs working together to create an AoE that just tears enemies apart, and I'm looking forward to trying that out. If you're in need of an Anemo support, Kazuha could make a good addition to your team. Now, it's important to consider a couple things when deciding whether or not to pull. First, how close are you to pity? Second, are you on your 50-50? And third, consider who's coming up. If you're 70 deep into the banner, you could only be looking at a couple pulls to get Kazuha. But if you're at 0, that's a much bigger commitment. And if you're at a 50-50, well, what happens if you lose and get Chi-Chi? You're back at 0 again, so big commitment. But you should also consider who's still to come, right? Yoimiya looks like a Pyro Ganyu and is probably going to be at or higher than her level. Kamisato Ayaka has been discussed since the beginning of the game and could be a favorite for a lot of people who have been here since the beginning. And if you're not in a financial position to roll for every 5-star, it becomes even more important to consider who's important for you to roll on. If you want a Yoimiya more than a Kazuha, you might want to skip his banner or not roll too deep into it. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that team compositions should also be considered here. My alt account's main team is Hu Tao, Xingqiu, Bennett, and Zhongli. I couldn't fit Kazuha into that team because it'd mean I'd have to replace Zhongli, and that's not going to happen. But maybe I want to have a second Pyro team for a particular variant of the Abyss. Or perhaps you could be a free-to-play player. In that case, Kazuha could fit in pretty well with a Zhongling or a Yanfei team comp. The main problem with this is you're going to want Xingqiu and Bennett on a lot of Pyro comps, which doesn't leave a lot of room for Kazuha. So, should you roll for him? Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think this is a great banner. Razor, Rosaria, and Bennett are all great additions for a team, and are all worth getting at least a couple constellations for. It remains to be seen how good Kazuha will actually be, as I'm avoiding reactions from Asia server use. But if he's as strong as I anticipate, he'd probably be a pretty good pickup if you don't already have a Venti. If you do have a Venti, then just consider how much you really want Kazuha. With all that said though, if you have the expendable cash, I think this is a good banner to roll on. Just keep in mind that a lot of YouTubers tend to put out clickbait about every character being broken, so in the coming days you'll probably see a decent amount of Kazuha is broken vids. Take those with a grain of salt. Alright guys, anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you all again next week.